The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of the front porch when Clara Whitmore first heard the dry, papery sound that made her blood run cold. She had been reaching for the milk pail, her mind already on the dozen chores that awaited her before the day grew too hot, when the unmistakable rattle froze her hand mid-reach. There, coiled beneath the bottom step like a rope of burnished copper and shadow, lay a rattlesnake nearly as thick as her wrist. Its triangular head swayed slightly, tasting the air with a black, forked tongue, while the deadly rattle at its tail continued its warning song. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The snake had positioned itself directly between her and the path to the well, effectively trapping her on the porch of the small log cabin that had been her father's, and now was hers alone. She stood perfectly still, her cotton dress stirring slightly in the morning breeze, aware that any sudden movement might provoke the creature into striking. The snake's eyes, like polished obsidian beads, seemed to watch her with ancient patience. Clara's own gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the prairie, remained fixed on the serpent as she slowly, carefully began to ease backward toward the cabin door where her father's old shotgun rested against the wall. The sound of approaching hoofbeats on the hard-packed earth of the trail made both woman and snake turn their attention toward the horizon. A rider was coming up the long slope that led to her property, his horse moving at an easy lope that spoke of long miles already traveled. Clara felt her heart quicken, not with relief but with a different kind of wariness. Living alone as she did, 10 miles from the nearest neighbor and 15 from town, unexpected visitors were rarely good news. The rider drew closer, and Clara could make out more details. He sat his horse with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, his broad shoulders squared beneath a faded blue work shirt. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but she could see the dark stubble along his jaw and the way his eyes moved constantly, taking in the lay of the land with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger in the landscape. When he spotted Clara standing motionless on the porch, the rider's hands stilled on the reins, and his horse slowed to a walk. It was then that his gaze dropped to the coiled snake, and Clara saw his posture change almost imperceptibly. His right hand moved away from the reins, hovering near the leather holster at his hip, though he made no move to draw the weapon. "Ma'am," he called softly, his voice carrying easily across the 20 yards that separated them. "I'm going to step down real slow-like. You just hold steady there." Clara nodded once, not trusting her voice. She watched as the stranger swung down from his saddle with fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground without a sound. He was tall, she noticed, with the lean build of a man who lived hard and ate simply. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes, stood ground-tied as if it had been trained to perfect stillness. The man studied the snake's position for a long moment, then looked back up at Clara. His eyes, she saw now, were the deep brown of rich earth after rain, and they held a steadiness that somehow eased the tight knot of fear in her chest. "Name's Ethan Cole," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the rattler. "I'm going to need you to trust me for the next minute or two." Before Clara could respond, Ethan began moving with deliberate slowness toward the woodpile that sat to one side of the cabin. His movements were so careful, so controlled, that even the nervous energy of his horse seemed to calm. He selected a length of split oak, perhaps 3 feet long and straight as an arrow shaft. Testing its weight in his hands, he approached the snake from an angle that would keep Clara well out of harm's way. The rattlesnake's head turned to track this new threat, its rattle increasing in tempo. Ethan stopped just outside striking distance, the piece of wood held low and ready. for several heartbeats. Man and serpent regarded each other in perfect stillness. Then, with a movement so quick Clara almost missed it, Ethan flicked the wood forward, striking the snake just behind its head and sending it sailing in a wide arc away from the cabin. The creature landed with a soft thud in the tall grass beyond the cleared yard, and immediately began slithering toward the creek bottom, disappearing into the brush with offended dignity. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding and found that her knees had gone weak with relief. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you." Ethan tossed the piece of wood back onto the pile and touched the brim of his hat. "Just glad I came along when I did, miss. That fellow had himself a prime spot picked out." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "You live here alone?" The question, though asked with obvious concern rather than threat, brought Clara's natural caution rushing back. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin slightly. "I manage well enough on my own, Mr. Cole." If Ethan noticed the subtle warning in her tone, he gave no sign of it. Instead, he nodded once and began walking back toward his horse. "I'm sure you do, ma'am. I was just thinking that Snake might have friends, and they do like to den up under porches and such." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had heard stories of settlers who had found entire nests of rattlesnakes beneath their homes, drawn by the cool shade and protection the structures provided. The thought of more serpents lurking beneath her feet made her skin crawl. "What would you suggest?" she asked, hating that she had to ask at all, but recognizing practical necessity when she saw it. Ethan paused with one hand on his saddle horn. "Well, if you don't mind my saying so, it might be wise to take a look around the foundation. Make sure there aren't any holes or gaps where they might be getting in. And maybe spread some tobacco leaves under there. Snakes don't care for the smell." He swung back into the saddle with the same fluid motion he had used to dismount, settling his weight with practiced ease. His horse stamped once and turned its head toward the trail, clearly eager to be moving again. "I thank you for your help, Mr. Cole," Clara said, meaning it. "If you're heading toward town, you might want to water your horse at the creek down the slope there. It runs clear and cold." Ethan touched his hat brim again, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Clara felt something pass between them in that brief connection. Not quite recognition, but an acknowledgement of some kind. Here was a man who understood the unspoken rules of the frontier. Offer help when it was needed, accept gratitude when it was given, and respect the boundaries that kept civilized people safe from one another. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said simply. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch a moment longer than necessary, he added, "You sure you'll be all right here?" Clara nodded, though she found herself oddly reluctant to see him go. "I'll be fine. I've got my father's shotgun, and I know how to use it." Ethan's mouth curved slightly at one corner, not quite a smile, but something that suggested approval. "I expect you do." He gathered his reins and turned his horse toward the creek. "You take care now, Miss Whitmore," Clara said after a moment's hesitation. "Clara Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore." He nodded once more, then urged his horse forward at an easy walk. Clara watched him go, noting the way he sat his saddle and the careful way his eyes continued to scan the landscape around him. Whatever else Ethan Cole might be, he was a man who had learned to stay alive in country that didn't forgive carelessness. As horse and rider disappeared beyond the rise, Clara became aware of the ordinary sounds of the morning returning, the lowing of her milk cow in the small pasture, the clucking of chickens in their coop, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods that lined the creek. The familiar sounds should have been comforting, but instead they seemed to emphasize how very alone she was out here. She looked down at the spot where the snake had been coiled, then at the piece of wood Ethan had used to send it away. Such a simple thing, really? The right tool, the right knowledge, the right timing. But it had made all the difference between safety and potential disaster. Clara picked up her milk pail and walked carefully down the steps, her eyes scanning the ground around the porch foundation. As she made her way toward the cow, she found herself thinking about Ethan Cole's hands, steady and sure as they wielded that piece of wood, gentle as they handled his horse's reins. She thought about his voice, quiet and calm even when facing down a venomous snake. And she thought about the way he had asked if she was all right, as if her answer actually mattered to him. Such thinking was foolish, she told herself firmly as she began the morning milking. Ethan Cole was a drifter, clearly, a man with the look of someone who never stayed in one place long enough to sink roots. She had learned the hard way not to depend on anyone but herself, and a chance encounter with a helpful stranger was no reason to start now. But as she worked, Clara found her gaze drifting often toward the trail where he had disappeared, and she could not quite shake the memory of those steady brown eyes or the gentle authority in his voice when he had told her to trust him. For just a moment, in a morning made dangerous by nature's wild unpredictability, she had trusted a stranger completely, and he had proved worthy of that trust. Clara had just finished straining the morning's milk when she heard the hoofbeats returning. She paused at the kitchen window, her hands still damp from washing the pail, and watched as Ethan Cole rode back up the slope toward her cabin. His horse moved more slowly now, no longer driven by the steady purpose of a man with miles to cover, and she could see that both rider and mount bore the dust of the trail. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the porch and dismounted, removing his hat as he approached. The morning sun caught the dark brown of his hair, showing streaks of lighter brown where it had been bleached by exposure to weather. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, and the way his clothes, though clean, showed the careful mending of a man who traveled far from any seamstress. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet courtesy she remembered. "I hope you don't mind my coming back. I got to thinking about what I said regarding those snakes, and it occurred to me that looking under a porch foundation isn't exactly a job for someone on their own." Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of ulterior motive, but found only genuine concern. Still, caution had kept her alive these past months since her father's passing, and she was not inclined to abandon it now. "That's thoughtful of you, Mr. Cole, but I've managed alone just fine." "I'm sure you have." He glanced toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing higher, promising another hot day. "But sometimes a second pair of eyes can spot what one might miss. And truth is, my horse could use a rest and some water before I head into town, if you wouldn't mind. That is." There was something in the way he phrased it, not asking for charity, but offering a trade of sorts. His help in exchange for rest and water for his mount. It was the kind of arrangement that preserved dignity on both sides, and Clara found herself appreciating the thoughtfulness behind it. "Your horse is welcome to water and rest," she said after a moment. "And I suppose it wouldn't hurt to have another set of eyes look for snake holes." Ethan's mouth curved slightly in what might have been relief. "Much obliged, ma'am," as he led his horse to the small trough near the well. Clara found herself watching the easy way he moved, the practiced efficiency with which he loosened the cinch and let the animal drink. His gear was well maintained but showed honest wear. The leather of his saddle darkened with age and weather. His rifle scabbard worn smooth where his leg had rubbed against it over countless miles. "You've been traveling long?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "A fair while," Ethan replied, running a gentle hand along his horse's neck. "Been working my way south from the Montana Territory. Thought I might winter somewhere warmer this year." Clara nodded, understanding. The Northern Territories could be brutal in winter, especially for a man traveling alone. "You're welcome to pull that gear off him if he needs to cool down properly." "Thank you kindly." While Ethan tended to his horse, Clara went back into the cabin and stood before her small pantry. Considering, the decent thing would be to offer the man a meal. He had helped her, after all, and frontier hospitality demanded no less. But meals shared between strangers could imply things that Clara was not prepared to imply, especially with a man she knew nothing about beyond his steady hands and careful manners. Finally, practical necessity won out over her reservations. She had rabbit stew left from yesterday's cooking and cornbread that was still fresh enough. If he chose to read more into the offer than simple gratitude, well, she still had her father's shotgun within easy reach. When she emerged from the cabin carrying a bowl and a thick slice of cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth, she found Ethan crouched beside the porch foundation, peering into the shadows beneath the raised floor. "Found something?" she asked, setting the food on the top step. "Not yet, but these gaps between the stones could let in more than just snakes." He straightened, accepting the bowl with a nod of thanks. "Mice, pack rats, maybe even a fox looking for shelter. You might want to think about chinking those holes before winter sets in proper." Clara settled herself on the porch step, maintaining a careful distance between them. Ethan sat down on the ground nearby, his back against the well housing, the bowl balanced on his knees. For a few moments, they ate in silence broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through the grass. "This is fine cooking," Ethan said quietly, not looking up from his bowl. "Been a while since I've had a proper meal." "Where did you eat last?" Clara asked, then immediately regretted the question. It sounded too much like prying into his personal affairs. But Ethan didn't seem to mind. "Cold camp last night, maybe 10 miles south of here. Haven't been to a proper town in near a week." He took another spoonful of stew, chewing thoughtfully. "This rabbit? Caught him yesterday evening. He was getting into my vegetable garden. Smart shooting. Takes skill to drop a rabbit clean without spoiling the meat." Clara felt a small glow of pride at the compliment. Her father had taught her to shoot, insisting that a woman living on the frontier needed to be able to provide for herself in all things. Papa always said if you're going to take a life, even a rabbit's, you owe it your best effort. Sounds like a wise man. He was. Clara found herself relaxing slightly. There was something about Ethan's quiet manner that invited confidence without demanding it. He used to say that the land would provide, but only if you knew how to ask properly. Ethan nodded, understanding. My grandfather used to say something similar. Claimed the earth would feed you if you learned to listen to what it was telling you. They fell into a comfortable silence again, the kind that can exist between two people who understand the value of quiet observation. Clara found herself studying Ethan's profile as he ate, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes continued to scan the landscape even while he focused on his meal. He was alert without being nervous, watchful without seeming suspicious. It was the wariness of a man who had learned to pay attention, not the jumpiness of someone running from something. When he finished eating, Ethan set the bowl aside and looked up at Clara. That was generous of you, Miss Whitmore. I don't take kindness lightly. It was little enough, considering what you did this morning. All the same, he stood and brushed the dust from his pants. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a proper look at those foundation gaps. And I noticed your north fence line has some posts leaning pretty hard. Storm damage, most likely. Clara's attention sharpened. The north fence had indeed been damaged in the last big wind, but she hadn't mentioned it to him. Either he was unusually observant, or he had been studying her property more carefully than she had realized. You're very thorough in your observations. Mr. Cole. If he caught the slight edge in her voice, he gave no sign of it. Habit, I suppose. A man learns to notice things that might matter later on. He met her gaze directly. I'm not the sort to take advantage of a woman living alone, if that's what's worrying you. But I am the sort to offer help when I see it's needed, especially to someone who's shown me kindness. Clara studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. She had learned to read men's faces during the months since her father's death. The traveling peddlers, the drifters, the well-meaning neighbors whose help sometimes came with uncomfortable expectations. But Ethan's expression remained steady and open, holding her gaze without challenge or retreat. The fence could use attention, she admitted finally. But I can't pay wages for the work. Didn't ask for any. A good meal and a place to rest my horse is payment enough for a few hours' work. He glanced toward the damaged fence line. Besides, that's the kind of repair that goes easier with two people. Clara felt herself wavering. Pride warred with practicality, and practicality was winning. The fence did need fixing, and winter was coming on. A woman alone could manage many things, but wrestling fence posts back into proper alignment was not one of them. All right, she said finally. But understand that this is a trade, not charity. I don't accept charity. Ethan's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Wouldn't think of offering any, ma'am. In my experience, folks who make it on their own out here don't need charity. Just a fair trade between neighbors. We're not neighbors, Mr. Cole. You're passing through. Yes, ma'am. But for today, at least, I'm here. And that fence won't fix itself. Clara found herself looking into those steady brown eyes again, weighing risks and benefits. There was danger in accepting help from a stranger, but there was also danger in letting necessary work go undone. And something in Ethan's manner suggested that he understood the difference between offering help and trying to take control. There are tools in the shed, she said at last. And thank you. Ethan nodded once, settling his hat back on his head. Thank you for the meal, Miss Whitmore. Shall we take a look at that fence? As they walked toward the damaged section of fencing, Clara found herself aware of the way Ethan moved, unhurried but purposeful. His eyes taking in the lay of the land and the condition of her property without seeming to judge or catalog. When they reached the fence line, he crouched down to examine the damaged posts, running his hands along the wood to test for rot or insect damage. Good cedar posts, he observed. They'll straighten up fine once we get them properly braced. Looks like the wind just caught them at a bad angle. Clara nodded, though she was thinking less about fence posts and more about the strange comfort she felt having another person nearby. Someone who seemed to understand that helping didn't mean taking over, and that independence didn't have to mean isolation. Perhaps, she thought, there could be such a thing as a fair trade between strangers after all. The shed held the kind of organized disorder that spoke of a man who had known his tools well. Clara watched as Ethan examined each implement with the respect of someone who understood that good tools were the difference between success and failure on the frontier. He selected a post-hole digger, testing its weight and balance, then picked up a length of rope and checked its condition with careful fingers. "Your father kept his equipment in fine shape," he observed, running his thumb along the edge of a shovel blade to test its sharpness. "These tools will outlast most of the men who use them." Clara felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of her father. He always said a dull tool was more dangerous than no tool at all. Smart thinking. Ethan gathered the tools they would need and headed toward the damaged fence line. "Mind if I ask what happened to him?" The question was asked gently, without prying insistence, giving Clara the option to answer or remain silent. She found herself appreciating the courtesy, even as she struggled with how much to reveal. "Fever," she said finally. "Last winter. He was helping a neighbor dig out from a snowstorm and caught a chill that turned into something worse." Ethan nodded, understanding the way such things could happen on the frontier, where a simple accident or illness could become a death sentence without proper medical care nearby. "I'm sorry for your loss. Must have been a hard winter for you." "I managed." Clara's voice carried the quiet pride of someone who had faced difficulty and survived it. "Papa taught me well before he passed." They reached the damaged section of fence, where 3 posts leaned at dangerous angles, their bases loosened by the combination of wind and rain that had accompanied the last big storm. The wire between them sagged badly, creating gaps large enough for cattle to wander through if any had been minded to test the barrier. Ethan walked the fence line slowly, examining each post and testing the tension in the wire. Clara watched him work, noting the methodical way he approached the problem. No rushing, no assumptions, just careful observation followed by thoughtful planning. "We'll need to reset these 3 completely," he said at last. "The holes have washed out too much to just straighten them. But the posts themselves are sound enough to use again." Clara nodded, rolling up her sleeves. "Where do we start?" If Ethan was surprised by her immediate readiness to work, he didn't show it. Instead, he began organizing the tools they would need. "First, we'll need to dig out the old posts and clear the holes. Then we can reset them properly and restring the wire." The work began in earnest as the morning sun climbed higher. Clara took one end of the 2-man saw while Ethan took the other, and together they cut through the tangled wire that held the damaged posts in place. The rhythm of the saw cutting through metal created its own music, the steady back-and-forth motion that required cooperation and timing between the 2 people working it. "Easy now," Ethan said quietly when Clara tried to push too hard on her stroke. "Let the saw do the work. Force it and the blade will bind." Clara adjusted her technique, finding the proper rhythm that allowed the blade to cut cleanly without fighting against itself. It was similar to many things her father had taught her, that the right way was often the patient way, that rushing usually led to poor results or injury. As they worked, she found herself stealing glances at her unexpected partner. Ethan's movements were economical and sure, never wasted but never hurried. When they finished cutting the wire free, he coiled it carefully, explaining that good wire was valuable and worth saving for repairs. "No sense in throwing away something that just needs straightening," he said, running the wire through his hands to feel for weak spots or breaks. "A little patience and most things can be made useful again." Clara wondered if he was talking about more than just fence wire, but his expression gave nothing away. The hardest work came when they began digging out the damaged posts. The prairie soil was tough even in good conditions, and the recent rains had made it both sticky and heavy. Clara wielded her shovel with determined strokes, matching Ethan's pace as they dug around the first leaning post. "You're handy with that shovel," Ethan observed after they had been working for a while. "Most folks who haven't done hard labor tend to tire out quick or hurt themselves trying to do too much at once." "Papa made sure I knew how to work," Clara replied, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead. "Said a woman on her own needed to be able to do whatever needed doing." He was right about that. Ethan's voice held genuine respect. "Takes a special kind of strength to make it alone out here." They dug in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the chunk of shovels biting into earth and the distant calling of meadowlarks in the grass. Clara found herself settling into the rhythm of the work, her body remembering the countless hours she had spent helping her father with similar tasks. When they had dug deep enough to free the first post, Ethan tested its stability with his hands. "Ready to pull her out?" Together they worked the post free from its hole, the sudden release causing Clara to stumble backward a step. Ethan's hand shot out to steady her, his grip firm but brief, releasing her the moment she regained her balance. "Thank you," she said, aware of the warmth where his hand had touched her arm. "My fault for not warning you it was ready to come free." His expression remained professionally courteous, but Clara thought she detected a slight flush across his cheekbones. They moved on to the second post, working with the improved coordination that came from shared effort. Clara noticed how Ethan adapted his movements to complement hers, neither trying to take over the work nor leaving her to struggle with tasks beyond her strength. It was a careful balance that spoke of experience working with different people in different situations. "You've done this kind of work before," she observed as they started on the third post. "Some worked on a ranch up in Colorado Territory for a couple of years. Good outfit. They paid fair wages and fed you proper." Ethan paused in his digging. "But I'm not much for staying in one place too long." "Why not?" The question slipped out before Clara could stop it, and she immediately regretted the personal nature of it. But Ethan didn't seem offended. "Just my nature, I suppose, always wondering what's over the next hill." He resumed digging, his rhythm steady and unhurried. "Some folks are meant to put down roots. Others are meant to keep moving. I've always been one of the second kind." Clara felt an unexpected pang of disappointment at his words, though she told herself it was foolish to feel anything at all about the plans of a man she had met only hours ago. When they had all three posts dug out, Ethan surveyed their work with satisfaction. "Now comes the precision part. These holes need to be exactly the right depth and spacing, or the fence won't hold properly." He showed Clara how to use a length of string to ensure the post holes were properly aligned, and how to measure the depth so that each post would sit at exactly the same height. It was painstaking work that required constant checking and rechecking, but Clara found herself appreciating the care he took to do things correctly. "My father always said anything worth doing was worth doing right the first time," she said as they worked on getting the measurements perfect. "Sounds like a wise man. My grandfather used to say something similar, measure twice, cut once." Ethan stretched the string taut between two stakes. "Course, that was back when I was more inclined to listen to advice. And now? Now I've learned most of those lessons the hard way." He grinned ruefully. "Turns out the old folks usually knew what they were talking about." As they reset the first post, Clara was struck by how naturally they worked together. Ethan would hold the post steady while she shoveled dirt back into the hole. Then she would tamp the soil firm while he checked that the post remained plumb and true. There was no need for constant direction or explanation. Each seemed to anticipate what the other needed. "Little more on the north side," Ethan said quietly as Clara worked the tamping bar around the base of the second post. She adjusted her efforts accordingly, and when Ethan checked the post with his level, it stood perfectly vertical. "That's good work," he said with genuine approval. Clara felt a warm glow of accomplishment at the praise. It had been months since anyone had recognized her efforts at anything, and she had forgotten how satisfying it could be to work alongside someone who appreciated skill and effort. As they worked on the final post, a young coyote emerged from the tall grass near the creek, watching them with curious yellow eyes. The animal seemed more interested than alarmed, tilting its head as it observed their activities. "Bold little fellow," Ethan commented, not pausing in his work but keeping one eye on the predator. "They've been getting braver lately," Clara said. "I think the drought has driven their usual prey closer to water, so they're ranging farther looking for food. You ever have trouble with them?" "Not yet, but I keep the chickens locked up tight at night, and I don't leave anything around that might attract them." The coyote watched them for a few more minutes, then trotted off with the unhurried pace of an animal that knew it was in no immediate danger. Ethan and Clara continued their work, stringing new wire between the reset posts and testing the tension to ensure it would hold against wind and weather. When they finished, the fence stood straight and strong, the wire properly taut, and the posts firmly seated in the ground. Clara stepped back to admire their work, feeling a deep satisfaction at the sight of a job well done. "That should hold through whatever weather comes," Ethan said, testing the fence's stability one final time. "Thank you," Clara said, meaning it deeply. "I couldn't have managed this alone." "Sure you could have, might have taken longer, but you'd have figured it out." Ethan began gathering the tools. "You've got the kind of determination that finds a way." As they walked back toward the cabin, Clara found herself reluctant to see the work end. There had been something deeply satisfying about the shared effort, the way they had worked together toward a common goal. It reminded her of helping her father with similar projects. But there was something different about it too, a sense of partnership rather than simply assistance. "Can I offer you some coffee before you head on?" she asked as they reached the tool shed. Ethan paused in the act of hanging up the post hole digger. "That would be welcome." "Thank you." As Clara pumped water for them both to wash the dirt from their hands, she found herself hoping he might linger a while longer. The day was still young, and there were other small repairs around the place that could benefit from an extra pair of hands. But more than that, she realized she was enjoying the company, the easy conversation and shared purpose that made the work feel less like labor and more like collaboration. Perhaps, she thought as she watched Ethan carefully clean each tool before putting it away. There was something to be said for accepting help when it was offered in the right spirit. And perhaps being independent didn't have to mean being completely alone. They were sharing coffee on the front porch, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the newly repaired fence line, when the sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road announced another visitor. Clara set down her cup and shaded her eyes against the sun, recognizing the familiar outline of Ezra Hutchins' buckboard as it approached. Ezra was one of her father's oldest friends, a weathered man in his 60s who had homesteaded his own spread about 8 miles north of Clara's place. He had been checking on her regularly since her father's passing, bringing news from town and offering help with the heavier work around the property. His visits had always been welcome, but Clara felt a knot of tension form in her stomach as she noticed the way his eyes fixed on Ethan's horse tied near the well. "Afternoon." "Clara," Ezra called as he pulled his team to a halt near the porch. His greeting was warm enough. But his gaze remained locked on Ethan, who had risen from his seat and moved to stand beside the porch rail in a gesture that was both polite and defensive. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hutchins," Clara replied, standing as well. "I wasn't expecting you today." "Had to come into town for supplies," Ezra said, climbing down from his wagon with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been stiffened by years of hard work. Thought I'd stop by and check on you. His eyes never left Ethan as he spoke. Seems you've got company. Clara felt the careful balance of the afternoon shifting beneath her feet. She could sense the tension building between the two men. Not hostility exactly, but the wary evaluation that occurred when strangers met in country where a man's character was often the only thing standing between life and death. Mr. Hutchins. This is Mr. Ethan Cole, she said carefully. He helped me with some fence repairs today. Mr. Cole. Ezra Hutchins is a neighbor and old friend of my father's. Ethan stepped forward and touched the brim of his hat respectfully. Mr. Hutchins. Pleasure to meet you. Ezra nodded curtly but didn't extend his hand. Cole. Don't believe I've seen you around these parts before. No, sir. I'm just passing through on my way south. Stopped to help Miss Whitmore with a snake problem this morning. Snake problem? Ezra's attention sharpened, and for the first time his concern seemed to focus on Clara rather than the stranger. What kind of snake problem? Clara quickly explained about the rattlesnake on the porch and Ethan's timely assistance. As she spoke, she watched Ezra's expression carefully, noting the way his suspicion gradually gave way to grudging appreciation for Ethan's help, though the wariness never completely disappeared. Lucky you came along when you did, Ezra admitted to Ethan, though his tone remained cool. Those rattlers can be mean customers, especially this time of year when they're looking for winter dens. Yes, sir. That's what I was thinking too. Figured it might be wise to check the foundation for holes they could get into. Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. And did you find any? A few gaps that could use chinking before cold weather sets in. Nothing that can't be fixed with some mortar and stone. Clara felt a flash of irritation at the way the two men were discussing her property as if she weren't standing right there. But she held her tongue. She understood that this was partly territorial behavior, Ezra establishing his role as her protector and Ethan demonstrating that he wasn't a threat. Well, Ezra said finally, I appreciate you helping Clara out. Not many strangers would take the time. Any decent man would do the same, Ethan replied quietly. Ezra studied him for a long moment, then reached into his wagon and pulled out a small burlap sack. He brought you some seed for that winter garden plot. Clara, Martha thought you might want to get some turnips and late cabbage in the ground before the weather turns. Clara accepted the bag gratefully. Martha Hutchins' garden was famous throughout the county, and her seeds were always carefully saved and stored. Please thank her for me. I've been meaning to get that plot started. She also sent along some of her apple butter. Knows how much you enjoyed it last time. Ezra handed her a small crock, but his eyes remained on Ethan. Clara, might I have a word with you privately? Clara felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but she nodded. Of course, Mr. Cole. Would you mind checking on your horse? I think I heard him whickering earlier. Ethan understood the dismissal immediately. Certainly. Thank you for the coffee. Miss Whitmore. He touched his hat to both of them and walked toward the well, moving just far enough away to give them privacy while remaining close enough to respond if needed. Clara, Ezra began once Ethan was out of earshot. I hope you know I'm not trying to interfere in your business, but I have to ask, what do you know about this man? He helped me with a dangerous situation this morning, Clara replied evenly. He's been polite and respectful, and he worked hard helping me fix that damaged fence. That's all well and good, but you can't be too careful about strangers, especially living out here alone. Ezra's voice carried the concern of a man who had known her since childhood. Has he said where he's from, where he's headed? He mentioned working in Colorado Territory, and he's traveling south for the winter. Clara felt defensive but tried to keep it out of her voice. Mr. Hutchins, I appreciate your concern, but I'm capable of judging people for myself. I know you are, child. You've got your father's good sense. But Thomas isn't here to watch out for you anymore. And there are men who might take advantage of a woman alone. Ezra glanced toward Ethan, who was examining his horse's hooves with careful attention. I'm not saying this fellow is one of them, but it pays to be cautious. Clara followed his gaze and watched as Ethan ran gentle hands along his horse's legs, checking for heat or swelling that might indicate injury. Everything about his movements spoke of a man who cared for his animals properly, who understood that a horse's welfare often meant the difference between life and death for a traveling man. He's done nothing to give me concern, she said finally. And I haven't lost my ability to think clearly just because Papa died. Ezra's expression softened slightly. Of course you haven't. You're one of the strongest women I know. Clara, I just worry about you out here alone, that's all. I understand. And I'm grateful for your concern. But I can't live my life afraid of every stranger who might need help. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Ethan finished his examination of his horse and began adjusting the animal's tack. His movements were unhurried and competent, showing the kind of care that came from years of depending on a horse for survival. Well, Ezra said at last, I suppose I should head home. Martha will be expecting me before dark. He paused, then added in a lower voice, If you need anything at all, you send word. I can be here in an hour. Thank you, Mr. Hutchins. That means a great deal to me. Ezra climbed back onto his wagon, but before taking up the reins, he called out to Ethan, Mr. Cole, you have a safe journey wherever you're headed. Ethan looked up from his horse and touched his hat. Much obliged, sir. Take care of yourself. As Ezra's wagon disappeared down the road, Clara found herself standing alone on the porch, acutely aware of the change in atmosphere his visit had brought. What had been a pleasant afternoon of shared work and easy conversation now felt weighted with unspoken questions and concerns. Ethan finished with his horse and walked back toward the porch, his expression carefully neutral. Nice fellow. Obviously cares about you. He was my father's best friend. He's been very kind since Papa died. Good to have neighbors who look out for you. Ethan paused at the bottom of the porch steps, not presuming to reclaim his seat without invitation. I should probably be heading on. Don't want to cause you any trouble with the local folks. Clara felt a sharp pang of disappointment at his words, followed immediately by irritation at herself for feeling it. Of course he would leave now. Ezra's visit had made it clear that a stranger's presence at her home would be noticed and discussed, and no decent man would want to compromise a woman's reputation. You don't have to leave on account of Mr. Hutchins, she said, though she wasn't sure what she was hoping for. It's not about him specifically, it's about understanding how things work in a place like this. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. A woman living alone has to be careful about appearances, and a traveling man needs to respect that. Clara knew he was right, but the prospect of spending the evening alone after the companionship of the day felt unbearably lonely. There's still some work that could be done before winter. That chicken coop roof you mentioned, and the foundation chinking. That's true. Ethan seemed to consider her words carefully. Though that kind of work might be better done when there are other folks around to see that everything's proper and above board. The suggestion hung in the air between them, the possibility of future work, future meetings. but conducted in a way that would satisfy the proprieties of frontier society. Clara found herself considering the implications. If Ethan stayed in the area for a while, working on various properties as many traveling men did, there would be opportunities for him to help with her repairs without creating the kind of speculation that could damage her reputation. There might be other property owners who could use help with winter preparations, she said carefully. And I could mention your availability to folks who might have work. That would be generous of you. Ethan's eyes held hers for a moment, and Clara thought she saw a flash of relief in them. A man with honest skills can usually find honest work, especially with winter coming on. There's a boarding house in town that caters to working men, Clara added. Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment, and her rates are fair. I'll keep that in mind. They stood looking at each other across the porch rail, both aware that they were negotiating something more complex than a simple employment arrangement. Clara was offering him a reason to stay in the area, and Ethan was indicating his willingness to accept such an arrangement if it could be managed respectably. Well, Ethan said finally, I suppose I should gather my things and head toward town before it gets too late. Of course. Clara felt a strange formality settling over them, replacing the easy camaraderie they had shared during the day's work. Thank you again for your help today. The fence repair and the snake problem both. Thank you for the meal and the coffee, and for trusting a stranger enough to let him help. Ethan walked to his horse and swung into the saddle with the fluid motion Clara was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. As he gathered his reins, he looked back at her standing on the porch. Miss Whitmore, if you do happen to hear of anyone needing work done, I'd be grateful if you'd put in a word for me. I'll be at Patterson's if anyone wants to find me. I'll do that, Clara replied. Safe travels, Mr. Cole. Good evening, ma'am. Clara watched him ride away for the second time that day. But this departure felt different from the first. This time, she had the sense that their paths would cross again, that this was not really an ending but a careful pause while they both considered what came next. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Clara gathered the coffee cups and went inside to begin preparing her solitary dinner. But as she worked, she found herself planning what she would say to the other property owners she knew, thinking about which of them might need help with winter preparations and how she could naturally mention a traveling man named Ethan Cole, who was skilled with tools and honest in his dealings. The day had started with a dangerous encounter with a rattlesnake and had ended with a more complex kind of danger altogether, the risk of allowing a stranger into her carefully ordered world. But as Clara looked out at the straight, strong fence line that now marked her northern boundary, she thought that perhaps some risks were worth taking, especially when they were calculated carefully and approached with eyes wide open. After all, winter was coming, and there was still much work to be done. 3 days later, Clara was hanging washing on the line behind her cabin when she heard the familiar sound of approaching hoofbeats. She paused, a damp shirt in her hands, and felt her heart quicken as she recognized Ethan's easy seat in the saddle. He had found work, as she had hoped he would. Samuel Morrison at the Double M Ranch had hired him to help with winter preparations, and word had already spread through the county that the traveling man was skilled and honest in his dealings. But this was the first time he had returned to her property since that afternoon when Ezra Hutchins had made it clear that a woman living alone needed to be careful about appearances. Clara had wondered if she would see him again, or if the complications of frontier propriety would keep them apart despite the careful arrangement they had discussed. Afternoon, Miss Whitmore, Ethan called as he dismounted near the well. Today he carried a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, and his horse bore the healthy sheen of an animal that had been well fed and properly cared for. I hope you don't mind my stopping by. I brought the materials for chinking those foundation gaps we talked about. Clara felt a flutter of relief and something warmer that she didn't want to examine too closely. Of course I don't mind. I've been wondering when you might get around to that work. Morrison gave me the afternoon off after we finished moving his cattle to the winter pasture. Figured this would be a good time to tackle the job. Ethan's manner was carefully professional, but Clara thought she detected a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. If you're agreeable to it, that is. Certainly. I'll just finish hanging these things and then I can help you. No need for you to get dirty with this kind of work. It's mostly crawling around under the porch with mortar and stones. Clara hung the last shirt on the line and turned to face him fully. Mr. Cole, I think we established the other day that I'm not afraid of getting my hands dirty. Ethan's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Yes, ma'am. I suppose we did establish that. They worked through the afternoon in companionable silence, Clara mixing mortar while Ethan crawled beneath the raised foundation of the cabin, identifying and filling the gaps that could admit snakes, rodents, or winter cold. It was painstaking work that required patience and attention to detail, and Clara found herself appreciating once again the careful way Ethan approached every task. Found the main entrance, he called from beneath the porch. Looks like something's been using this hole regular-like. Probably that pack rat that's been getting into your grain stores. Can you seal it properly? Oh yes, few good stones and some mortar. It'll be tight as a drum. There was a pause. Then Ethan's voice again, slightly muffled by the wooden floor above him. Miss Whitmore, you might want to check your grain barrels. Make sure you've got tight-fitting lids on everything. Clara made a mental note to inspect her stores more carefully. Pack rats could do considerable damage to winter supplies if they weren't kept out. And with cold weather coming on, she couldn't afford to lose any of her carefully hoarded provisions. By the time they finished the foundation work, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pale orange. Ethan emerged from beneath the porch covered in dust and cobwebs, but with the satisfaction of a job well done written clearly on his face. That should keep the varmints out, he said, brushing dirt from his clothes. And it'll help hold the heat in come winter, too. I'm grateful for the work, Clara said, meaning it. What do I owe you for the materials and labor? Ethan shook his head. Morrison paid me fair wages for this week's work, and he gave me the mortar and stones from his own supplies. Consider it a neighbor helping a neighbor. We're not neighbors, Clara said automatically, echoing her words from their first meeting. No, Ethan agreed quietly. But we're not strangers anymore either. Clara felt something shift in the air between them at his words. There was truth in what he said. They had moved beyond the careful politeness of strangers. But what exactly they had become was harder to define. Would you like some coffee before you head back to town? She asked, surprised by how much she hoped he would say yes. That would be welcome. It's been a dusty afternoon. Clara went inside to prepare the coffee while Ethan washed the dirt from his hands and face at the pump. When she returned to the porch with 2 steaming cups, she found him sitting on the top step, his hat resting beside him and his dark hair still damp from washing. The evening light caught the silver threads at his temples that she hadn't noticed before, and she realized he was probably older than she had first thought, perhaps 35 or even 40. She settled herself on the step beside him, careful to maintain a proper distance, and they sat in comfortable silence watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding the thermal currents that rose from the warming earth, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its liquid evening song. It's peaceful here, Ethan said after a while. I can see why your father chose this spot to build. He said it reminded him of a place in Ohio where he grew up, near a creek, with good water and timber, but open enough to see trouble coming from a long way off. Smart thinking. A man needs to be able to see what's approaching in country like this. Clara glanced at him sideways, noting the way his eyes continued to scan the landscape even as they talked. You sound like you speak from experience. Some. Ethan's voice carried a note of reserve that suggested painful memories. I learned early that it pays to be watchful. Clara wanted to ask more, but something in his manner warned her away from pressing. Instead, she sipped her coffee and watched as the first bats began their evening hunt, dark shapes flitting against the deepening sky. Miss Whitmore, Ethan said suddenly, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. May I ask you something? Of course. Have you ever been, that is, did you ever have a beau before your father passed? Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected question. It was personal in a way that their previous conversations had carefully avoided, and she wasn't sure how to respond. The honest answer was complicated. There had been young men who had shown interest over the years, but her father's illness and death had put an end to any such considerations. There was someone, she said finally, a young man from town. But when Papa took sick, well, not many men are willing to take on a woman with responsibilities. Ethan nodded, understanding. Their loss, he said simply. And you? Clara asked, surprised by her own boldness. Have you ever been married? No, ma'am. Came close once, but... He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. The traveling life doesn't suit everyone. Most women want a man who'll stay put, build something permanent. Can't say I blame them for that. But you've never wanted to stay put yourself? Ethan was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and distant. I used to think I didn't, but lately, I've been wondering if maybe I just never found the right reason to stop moving. Clara felt her breath catch at his words. There was something in his tone that suggested he might have found such a reason now, though he was too much a gentleman to say so directly. Mr. Cole, she said carefully, there's something I need to tell you. Ethan turned to look at her, his brown eyes serious in the fading light. What is it? Clara found herself studying his face, the strong line of his jaw, the laugh lines around his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead. She had been thinking about this moment for days, weighing her words and wondering if she had the courage to speak them. I've never been kissed, she said in a rush, the words tumbling out before she could lose her nerve. I mean, properly kissed. By a man who meant something by it. Ethan went very still beside her, and Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. What had possessed her to say such a thing? It was too personal, too forward, too much like an invitation for a respectable woman to offer. Clara, Ethan said quietly, and she realized it was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his voice made something flutter in her chest. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I shouldn't have said that. It was improper of me. No. Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. Don't apologize for speaking honestly. It's a rare thing. Honesty like that. He was quiet for a moment, and Clara could hear the soft sound of his breathing, the creak of the wooden step beneath them, the distant lowing of her cow in the pasture. If that's so, he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper, then I'd be honored to be your first, but only if you're certain it's what you want. Clara turned to look at him and found his eyes steady on hers, warm and patient and kind. There was no pressure in his gaze, no demand, only a gentle question that she was free to answer or not as she chose. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've been certain for days now. I just didn't know how to say it." Ethan reached out and gently touched her hand where it rested on the step between them. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from work, and Clara felt a little shiver of awareness at the contact. "Then we'll start slow," he said softly. "Just this. For now." Clara looked down at their joined hands and felt something settle into place inside her chest, a sense of rightness that she had never experienced before. They sat like that as the last light faded from the sky, their fingers intertwined, neither speaking nor needing to speak. Above them, the first stars began to appear, and somewhere in the grass a cricket began its evening song. Clara thought about all the evenings she had sat on this porch alone, watching the sunset and listening to the sounds of the prairie settling into night. She had thought herself content with solitude, had told herself that independence was worth the loneliness. But now, with Ethan's hand warm in hers and his quiet presence beside her in the gathering dusk, she understood that there was a difference between being alone by choice and being alone by necessity. And for the first time since her father's death, she began to imagine a future that might include something more than mere survival. "Clara," Ethan said softly as the evening star appeared above the horizon. "Yes? Would it be all right if I came back tomorrow? Morrison's got more work for me, but I could stop by after." Clara felt a smile spread across her face, the first truly happy smile she had worn in months. "I'd like that very much." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, then reluctantly released it and reached for his hat. "I should head back to town before it gets full dark. Mrs. Patterson doesn't like her boarders coming in too late." Clara stood with him, suddenly reluctant to see him go. The evening had been perfect in its simplicity, honest work, honest conversation, and the beginning of something that felt like hope. "Be careful on the road," she said as he swung into his saddle. "I will. You lock up tight tonight, and check those grain barrels tomorrow." "I will." Ethan gathered his reins but didn't immediately urge his horse forward. Instead, he looked down at Clara standing on her porch, her hair catching the last rays of sunset and her eyes bright with something that hadn't been there before. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Ethan." As horse and rider disappeared into the gathering darkness, Clara remained on the porch, her hands still tingling from his touch and her heart beating faster than usual. Tomorrow felt like a promise now, and the evening star seemed to shine a little brighter in the clear prairie sky. Clara woke to the sound of wind howling around the corners of the cabin and rain drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. She lay still for a moment, listening to the storm and trying to gauge its severity by the sounds alone. This was no gentle autumn shower. The wind had a fierce edge to it that spoke of serious weather, the kind that could reshape the landscape in a single night. Lightning flashed outside her bedroom window, illuminating the interior of the cabin in stark white light, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations. Clara sat up in bed, her heart racing. The storm was directly overhead now, and from the sound of it, getting worse by the minute. She rose and pulled on her wrapper, then padded to the kitchen window to look out at her property. Another flash of lightning revealed a scene that made her stomach clench with worry. The rain was coming down in sheets so thick she could barely make out the barn, and the newly planted winter garden that she had seeded just days before was being pummeled by the downpour. But it was the sight of water rushing past the cabin that truly alarmed her. The gentle slope that normally carried rainwater harmlessly away toward the creek had become a torrent, and she could see that the runoff was cutting a new channel directly through her garden plot. If the storm continued much longer, it would wash away all her winter plantings and carve a gully that would be impossible to repair. Clara dressed quickly in her oldest work clothes and heavy boots, then grabbed her father's oilskin coat from the peg by the door. She would need tools, a shovel to dig drainage channels, perhaps some boards to redirect the water flow. The work would be miserable in this weather, but losing her winter vegetables would be catastrophic. She had counted on those turnips and cabbages to see her through the cold months ahead. As she reached for the door handle, another flash of lightning revealed a figure on horseback approaching through the storm. Clara's breath caught as she recognized Ethan's silhouette, hunched against the driving rain but unmistakably him. What was he doing out in weather like this? She flung open the door as he rode up to the porch, rain immediately driving into the cabin despite the protection of the roof overhang. "Ethan!" "Ew," she called over the sound of the storm. "What are you doing out in this?" He dismounted quickly, leading his horse under the partial shelter of the porch overhang. Both man and animal were soaked through, water streaming from Ethan's hat brim and his horse's mane. "Saw the way the storm was building when I was at Morrison's place," he called back, having to raise his voice to be heard over the wind. "Worried about that new garden plot of yours. This kind of rain can wash out plantings faster than you can blink." Clara felt a warm rush of gratitude that he had thought of her problems in the midst of the storm. "I was just getting ready to go out and try to dig some drainage channels." "Not by yourself. You're not." Ethan's voice was firm. "This is dangerous work in weather like this. Easy to get hurt when you can't see what you're doing." Another flash of lightning illuminated the yard, and Clara could see that the situation was even worse than she had feared. The water rushing past the cabin had increased in volume, and what had been a small erosion problem was rapidly becoming a major washout. "We have to do something," she said urgently. "If that water keeps flowing through the garden, I'll lose everything I planted." Ethan nodded grimly. "We'll need to dig a diversion channel to send the water around the garden instead of through it. And we'll need to work fast. Storms like this can last all night." They gathered tools from the shed, working by feel in the darkness broken only by intermittent lightning flashes. Clara found 2 shovels and a mattock while Ethan located some boards that could be used to reinforce their drainage work. The rain soaked through their clothing within minutes, but there was no time to worry about comfort. "Stay close to me," Ethan instructed as they headed toward the garden. "It's easy to get turned around in weather like this, and the last thing we need is for one of us to fall into that washout." They worked side by side in the driving rain, taking turns with the shovels to dig a new channel that would redirect the floodwater away from Clara's precious plantings. The work was backbreaking. The saturated soil was heavy and sticky, and the darkness made every movement treacherous. Lightning provided their only illumination, creating a surreal landscape of stark shadows and blinding white light. "Here!" Ethan shouted over the storm as another flash revealed the best spot for their diversion. "If we can get a channel cut from here to that low spot near the fence, it should carry the water away from the garden." Clara nodded and began digging where he indicated. The physical exertion helped warm her chilled body, but she could feel water running down her back beneath the oilskin coat. Beside her, Ethan worked with steady determination, his movements economical and sure even in the difficult conditions. As they dug, the storm seemed to intensify rather than abate. The wind howled around them, driving the rain horizontally at times and making it difficult to breathe. Clara's hands became numb with cold despite the work, and she had to stop periodically to wipe water from her eyes. "How much deeper?" she called to Ethan during a brief lull in the wind. "Another foot should do it," he replied, pausing to check their progress. "Once we get it deep enough, the water will find its own way." They continued digging, and gradually Clara became aware that their channel was beginning to work. A trickle of water appeared in the bottom of the ditch they had carved, then grew to a steady flow as more runoff found the new path. But just as it seemed they might succeed, disaster struck. Clara was working at the edge of the washout when the saturated earth beneath her feet suddenly gave way. She felt herself falling backward toward the rushing water, her arms windmilling as she fought to regain her balance. The muddy slope offered no purchase, and she knew she was about to tumble into the flood. Strong hands seized her arms just as she began to fall, hauling her back from the edge with a force that left her breathless. Ethan pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her to steady her on the treacherous ground. "I've got you," he said close to her ear, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You're safe." Clara found herself pressed against his solid warmth, acutely aware of his strength and the protective circle of his arms. For a moment that seemed to stretch much longer than it actually lasted. They stood locked together in the storm, rain streaming down their faces and lightning flickering around them. "Thank you," she managed when she found her voice again. "I would have fallen right into that water." Ethan's arms tightened around her briefly before he reluctantly released her. "Can't have that. Still too much work to do." But Clara noticed that he kept one hand on her arm as they returned to their digging, steadying her on the slippery ground. The simple touch sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of their work. They labored on through the night, taking turns digging and reinforcing their makeshift drainage system with boards and stones. Gradually, their efforts began to show results. The new channel carried more and more of the floodwater away from the garden, and the erosion that had threatened Clara's winter plantings slowed to a manageable trickle. As dawn began to break gray and wet over the storm-battered landscape, the rain finally began to ease. Clara and Ethan stood in their muddy channel, exhausted but victorious, watching clean water flow harmlessly away from the rescued garden. "We did it," Clara said, hardly able to believe it. Her winter vegetables were safe. The worst of the erosion had been stopped, and the drainage system they had built would help protect against future storms. "We did," Ethan agreed, leaning on his shovel and surveying their work with satisfaction. He was covered in mud from head to toe, his hair plastered to his head and his clothes sodden, but there was a glow of accomplishment in his eyes. Clara looked at him standing there in the pale morning light. This man who had ridden through a dangerous storm to help her save her garden, and felt something shift permanently in her chest. This was not the careful courtesy of a stranger, or even the practical cooperation of neighbors. This was something deeper, a partnership forged in crisis, a trust built through shared struggle. "Ethan," she said softly, stepping closer to him, "I don't know how to thank you for this." He reached out and gently brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "No thanks needed. We're a team now." The simple words carried more weight than any grand declaration. Clara looked into his eyes and saw her own feelings reflected there, the recognition that what had begun as attraction had deepened into something much more substantial. They had faced the storm together and emerged stronger for it. "Come inside," she said, suddenly aware that they were both shivering with cold and exhaustion. "You need dry clothes and hot coffee before you catch your death." Ethan hesitated. "Clara, it's not proper for me to come inside. Not when you're alone. After what we've just been through together. I think we're past worrying about what's strictly proper," Clara replied firmly. "Besides, You can't ride back to town in this condition. You'll make yourself sick. She was right, and they both knew it. Ethan nodded gratefully and followed her toward the cabin, pausing only to see to his horse's needs first. Clara appreciated that about him, even exhausted and cold. He put his animal's welfare before his own comfort. Inside the warm cabin, Clara busied herself building up the fire while Ethan stood dripping on the kitchen floor, suddenly seeming uncertain about his presence in her private space. "There are some of my father's clothes in the bedroom chest," Clara said without turning around. "They should fit you well enough. You can't sit around in those wet things." When Ethan emerged from the bedroom wearing Thomas Whitmore's old work shirt and pants, Clara felt her heart constrict. The sight of him in her father's clothes should have felt strange or inappropriate. But instead it seemed somehow right, as if he belonged in this house, in this life she was building. They sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee and eating the breakfast Clara prepared, both of them moving carefully around the new intimacy that the storm had created between them. The easy companionship was still there, but it was layered now with something deeper and more complex. "The garden should be fine now," Ethan said as he watched the last of the storm clouds clear away through the window. "That drainage channel will handle anything short of a real flood." "Thanks to you," Clara replied. "I never could have managed it alone." "You would have found a way. You always do." Clara studied his profile as he gazed out at the brightening day, noting the confident set of his shoulders and the way his presence seemed to fill her small kitchen. Having him here felt natural in a way that surprised her, as if the storm had washed away the last of the barriers between them. "Ethan," she said quietly, and he turned to meet her eyes. "I'm glad you came. Not just for the garden, but I'm glad you were here." The simple statement carried layers of meaning, and Ethan seemed to understand them all. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and sure. "So am I," he said simply. "So am I." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in hours, sending shafts of golden light across the rescued garden and the newly carved drainage channel that would protect it. Clara looked out at the evidence of their shared labor and felt a deep contentment settle over her. The storm had tested them, and they had not been found wanting. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Clara stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, her hands trembling slightly as she attempted to pin her hair into a more elaborate style than her usual simple braid. The pale blue dress laid out on her bed was one she hadn't worn since before her father's death. The finest dress she owned, made of soft wool with small pearl buttons down the front and lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Tonight was the autumn dance at the schoolhouse, an event she had avoided for the past year out of respect for her mourning and her own reluctance to face the well-meaning but often intrusive questions of her neighbors. But this year was different. This year she would not be going alone. The invitation had come from Ethan 3 days ago, delivered with the careful formality of a man who understood the significance of what he was asking. Would she do him the honor of accompanying him to the dance? It was a public declaration of sorts. She knew, an announcement to the entire community that their friendship had developed into something more substantial. A soft knock at the door interrupted her struggle with the hairpins. "Clara? It's me." She hurried to open the door, finding Ethan standing on her porch dressed in clothes she had never seen him wear before. His dark suit was well cut and obviously expensive, though it showed the careful mending that spoke of a man who traveled light and made his possessions last. His boots were polished to a shine, and his hair had been trimmed and combed back neatly. He looked like a different man from the dusty traveler who had first helped her with the rattlesnake. Yet the steady kindness in his brown eyes remained unchanged. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, his gaze taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment. "Thank you. You look quite distinguished yourself." Ethan smiled and removed his hat, revealing the full effect of his grooming. "Had to clean up proper for such an important evening. Mrs. Patterson was kind enough to help with the pressing." Clara noticed the small nosegay of prairie flowers in his hand, asters and late-blooming goldenrod tied with a blue ribbon that matched her dress. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "These are lovely," she said as he presented them to her. "However did you know what color I'd be wearing?" "Lucky guess," Ethan replied. But Clara suspected he had asked Martha Hutchins about appropriate flowers. Just as she suspected Martha had been the one to suggest the blue ribbon. The older woman had been cautiously supportive when Clara had mentioned her intention to attend the dance, though she had made it clear that all eyes would be watching. As Ethan helped her into his borrowed wagon, Samuel Morrison had insisted he take the good wagon for such an occasion. Clara felt a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with the evening ahead and everything to do with the man beside her. Their relationship had deepened considerably since the night of the storm, moving from careful friendship to something that felt like genuine courtship. But tonight would be their first public appearance as a couple, and Clara knew it would set tongues wagging throughout the county. "Nervous?" Ethan asked as they drove toward town, as if reading her thoughts. "A little," Clara admitted. "It's been a long time since I went to a social gathering, and I've never gone with... that is, I've never had an escort before." Ethan reached over and briefly covered her gloved hand with his own. "We'll take it slow. Just a few dances, some conversation with your neighbors, and home at a respectable hour. Nothing that should cause any scandal." Clara appreciated his understanding of the delicate nature of their situation. As a widow, though she had never been married, her status as a woman who had inherited property and lived independently earned her similar respect. She had certain freedoms that unmarried girls did not. But those freedoms came with the expectation that she would conduct herself with appropriate dignity. The schoolhouse was already bright with lamplight when they arrived, and the sound of fiddle music drifted across the evening air. Wagons and buggies filled the yard, and Clara could see familiar faces through the windows as couples moved in the patterns of a Virginia reel. "Ready?" Ethan asked as he helped her down from the wagon. Clara smoothed her skirts and checked that her hair was still properly pinned. "Ready." The conversation in the schoolhouse didn't exactly stop when they entered, but it certainly quieted. Clara felt the weight of curious gazes as Ethan escorted her to where the other ladies had left their wraps, his hand steady at her elbow. She recognized most of the faces, neighbors she had known for years, families her father had helped during difficult times, young people she had watched grow up. Martha Hutchins was the first to approach, her weathered face wreathed in smiles. "Clara, dear, you look lovely. And Mr. Cole, how nice to see you again." Other greetings followed, some warm, some politely curious, a few coolly reserved. Clara had expected as much. A woman living alone who suddenly appeared with a traveling man as her escort was bound to generate speculation. But as the evening progressed, she found that Ethan's respectful demeanor and obvious regard for her comfort won over even the most skeptical observers. When the fiddle struck up a waltz, Ethan offered her his arm. "Would you honor me with this dance?" Clara's heart fluttered as she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. She had learned to waltz from her father years ago, but she had never danced with anyone else. Ethan's lead was firm and confident, guiding her through the steps with an ease that spoke of considerable experience. "You dance well," she murmured as they swept around the floor. "My mother insisted I learn," Ethan replied, spinning her gently under his arm. "She said a gentleman should be able to conduct himself properly in any social situation." Clara found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the dance, enjoying the way Ethan's hand rested at her waist and the gentle pressure of his fingers guiding her movements. Around them, other couples moved in the same graceful patterns, but Clara felt as though she and Ethan were dancing alone. "People are watching us," she observed quietly as they turned near the edge of the dance floor. "Let them watch," Ethan replied, his voice low and warm near her ear. "We're not doing anything improper." When the waltz ended, Ethan escorted her to the side of the room where punch was being served. Several of the older men approached to engage him in conversation, and Clara was pleased to see how naturally he fit into the community gathering. He spoke knowledgeably about crops and weather, listened respectfully to opinions about local politics, and answered questions about his background without seeming evasive or secretive. "Fine young man," commented Judge Harrison, one of the most respected men in the county. "Morrison speaks well of his work, and I hear he's been helpful to several other property owners as well." Clara felt a warm glow of pride at the praise. Ethan had indeed made a good impression during his weeks in the area, taking on various jobs and conducting himself with the kind of steady reliability that frontier communities valued above all else. As the evening progressed, Clara found herself enjoying the social gathering more than she had expected. It felt good to be part of the community again, to share news and gossip with her neighbors, to laugh at the familiar jokes and stories that made up the fabric of small-town life. And having Ethan at her side made it all the sweeter. When the fiddle player announced the last dance of the evening, another waltz, Ethan again offered her his arm. This time, as they moved together across the floor, Clara felt something settle into place in her chest. This was what she wanted, this partnership, this sense of belonging not just to a community but to another person. "Clara," Ethan said softly as the music drew to a close, "there's something I need to ask you." Before he could continue, they were interrupted by a voice from the edge of the dance floor. "Excuse me, Mr. Cole, but might I have a word?" Clara turned to see Reverend William Ashford, the Methodist minister who served several communities in the area. He was a good man, known for his practical approach to frontier religion and his genuine concern for his congregants. But Clara felt a flutter of unease at his serious expression. "Of course, Reverend," Ethan replied politely, though Clara noticed a slight tension in his shoulders. "I was hoping we might speak outside for a moment, privately." Clara felt her heart sink. She had been expecting this, the inevitable conversation where the community's moral authority would question Ethan's intentions toward her. It was the way things were done in small towns, where everyone felt entitled to have an opinion about everyone else's business. "I'll wait here," she said quietly, squeezing Ethan's hand in encouragement. The two men stepped outside, leaving Clara to endure the curious glances of her neighbors. Martha Hutchins appeared at her side almost immediately, offering moral support in the way that frontier women had perfected over generations. "Don't you worry, dear," Martha said quietly. "Reverend Ashford is a fair man. He's just doing what he thinks is right." Clara nodded, though she couldn't help feeling anxious about what was being discussed outside. Through the schoolhouse window, she could see the shadowy figures of the two men in earnest conversation, though she couldn't make out their words. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Ethan and the Reverend returned. Clara searched Ethan's face for any sign of how the conversation had gone. finding his expression carefully neutral but his eyes warm when they met hers. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Cole," Reverend Ashford said formally. Then, turning to Clara, he added, "Miss Whitmore, I hope you'll continue to be a regular at our services." "Of course, Reverend," Clara replied, though she wondered what exactly had prompted that particular comment. As people began to gather their belongings and prepare for the journey home, Ethan helped Clara with her wrap and escorted her back to their wagon. They drove in silence for the first mile, both lost in their own thoughts about the evening's events. "What did Reverend Ashford want to discuss?" Clara finally asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins as he guided the horses along the moonlit road. "He wanted to know my intentions toward you, and he wanted to make it clear that the community would be watching to ensure those intentions were honorable." Clara felt a flush of embarrassment and irritation. "I'm sorry you had to endure that. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "He wasn't questioning your judgment," Ethan said gently. "He was looking out for your reputation. In a community like this, that matters." "And what did you tell him?" Ethan drew the wagon to a stop beside a grove of cottonwoods that bordered the road. In the moonlight, Clara could see the seriousness in his expression as he turned to face her. "I told him that my intentions were entirely honorable, that I care for you deeply and would never do anything to compromise your standing in the community." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "And I told him that I hoped, when the time was right, to ask for your hand in marriage." Clara's breath caught in her throat, though she had sensed the direction their relationship was heading. Hearing the words spoken aloud made her heart race with a mixture of joy and nervous anticipation. "Clara," Ethan continued, reaching for her hands, "I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel like I've been looking for you my whole life. Would you consider becoming my wife?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the hopes and fears that came with such a momentous decision. Clara looked into Ethan's earnest face and saw her own future reflected there. A future of shared work and shared dreams, of partnership and companionship and the kind of love that grew stronger through facing life's challenges together. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible in the quiet night. "Yes. I would be honored to be your wife." Ethan's face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious expression into something radiant with joy. He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and reverent that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "I promise you won't regret this," he said softly. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're happy and cared for." As they resumed their journey toward Clara's cabin, she felt as though the entire world had shifted around her. This morning she had been a woman alone, independent but isolated. Tonight, she was an engaged woman with a partner to share both the burdens and the joys of frontier life. The dance had been a test of sorts, a way for the community to measure both Ethan's character and their compatibility as a couple. And though Clara knew there would be more challenges ahead, more tests to pass and obstacles to overcome, she felt confident that they would face them together. After all, they had already weathered their first storm. The morning after their engagement, Clara woke to find frost silvering the grass outside her bedroom window and the first real hint of winter in the air. She lay still for a moment, watching her breath mist in the cold cabin, and felt a contentment settle over her that was deeper than anything she had ever experienced. Today, Ethan would come to stay. They had talked long into the night after returning from the dance, making plans with the careful consideration of two people who understood that marriage on the frontier was as much a practical partnership as it was a romantic union. Ethan would move his few belongings from Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and take up residence in the small room off the kitchen that had served as her father's study. It wasn't entirely proper for them to live under the same roof before the wedding. But winter was coming fast, and the practical demands of preparing for the cold months ahead outweighed the niceties of social convention. Besides, as Ethan had pointed out with a gentle smile, they had already weathered one storm together. They could certainly manage the careful propriety required for the few weeks until Reverend Ashford could perform the marriage ceremony. Clara rose and dressed quickly in the chill air, then built up the fire and put coffee on to brew. Through the kitchen window, she could see Ethan approaching with his horse and a small pack mule laden with his possessions. The sight of him riding up the familiar path with the clear intention of staying sent a warm flutter through her chest. "Morning," he called as he dismounted near the well. "Thought I'd get an early start on moving in, if that's still agreeable to you." "More than agreeable," Clara replied, stepping out onto the porch despite the cold. "Coffee's brewing, and I've got biscuits in the oven." Ethan's belongings, when unpacked, proved to be remarkably modest for a man his age. A few changes of clothes, carefully maintained and mended, his grandfather's pocket watch and his mother's Bible, a set of well-used but high-quality tools, a small collection of books that spoke of an education more extensive than his humble circumstances might suggest, and wrapped in oiled cloth, a daguerreotype of a stern-faced man and gentle-looking woman who Clara assumed were his parents. "They died when I was 17, Ethan explained quietly when he noticed her looking at the photograph. "Fever took them both within a week of each other. That's when I started traveling." Clara touched his arm gently, understanding now some of the restlessness that had driven him from place to place for so many years. "I'm sorry. It must have been very difficult, losing them so young." "It was, but I think they'd be pleased to know I finally found a reason to stop wandering." He covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and reassuring. "A reason to build something lasting." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both new and comfortably familiar. They rose before dawn to tend the animals and complete the morning chores, working side by side with the easy coordination they had developed over the weeks of their courtship. Ethan proved to be an excellent partner in the daily work of frontier life, strong enough to handle the heavy tasks but careful to include Clara in all decisions about her property. Together, they completed the winter preparations that would have been nearly impossible for Clara to manage alone. They chinked the gaps in the cabin walls with fresh mortar, laid in a store of firewood that would last through the coldest months, and reinforced the barn against the winds that would soon sweep down from the north. Ethan's experience with livestock proved invaluable as they prepared the animals for winter, ensuring that Clara's small herd would be properly sheltered and fed. But it was the small intimacies of shared domestic life that truly marked the change in their relationship. The way Ethan hung his hat on the peg beside hers, the comfortable silence they shared over breakfast as they planned the day's work, the gentle tease in his voice when he caught her humming while she worked, the way he always ensured she had the warmest seat by the fire in the evenings. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a section of the chicken coop roof that had been damaged in an earlier storm, Clara found herself watching Ethan's hands as he guided the hammer with practiced precision. His movements were economical and sure, wasting no motion, and she realized that this careful efficiency extended to everything he did. There was something deeply reassuring about his competence, his quiet confidence in his ability to solve problems and complete necessary tasks. "You're staring," he observed without looking up from his work, though she could hear the smile in his voice. "Just thinking," Clara replied, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite the cool air. "About what?" "About how lucky I am." The words slipped out before she could think better of them, and she felt her blush deepen. I mean, how fortunate it was that you came along when you did. Ethan paused in his hammering and looked down at her from his perch on the roof. His expression was serious now, his brown eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart flutter. Clara, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. I wasn't just passing through when I found you that first day. I'd been traveling aimlessly for months, looking for something I couldn't even name. But the moment I saw you standing on that porch, facing down that rattlesnake with nothing but courage and determination, I knew I'd found what I'd been searching for. The admission hung in the air between them, more powerful than any declaration of love. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes as she understood what he was telling her, that their meeting hadn't been mere chance, but the kind of providence that frontier people learn to recognize and be grateful for. I'm glad you stopped, she said simply, and saw his face light up with the smile that never failed to warm her heart. As November deepened into early winter, their preparations took on increased urgency. The first serious snowfall could come at any time, and there were still tasks to complete. They worked together to harvest the last of the root vegetables from Clara's garden, storing them properly in the root cellar that Ethan had helped her expand and improve. They salted and smoked meat from the pig that Samuel Morrison had sold them at a fair price, ensuring they would have protein through the lean months ahead. It was during one of these busy days that Martha Hutchins arrived with unexpected news. Clara was in the barn helping Ethan repair a broken stall gate when they heard the approach of the familiar wagon. Clara, dear, Martha called as she climbed down from her seat. I hope you don't mind my dropping by unannounced, but I have something I wanted to discuss with you both. They gathered around Martha's wagon, where she produced a large basket covered with a clean cloth. I've been talking with some of the other ladies in the area, and we've decided we'd like to host a wedding celebration for you and Mr. Cole. Nothing too elaborate, mind you, but something proper to mark the occasion. Clara felt a rush of warmth at the unexpected kindness. She had assumed their wedding would be a simple affair, just the ceremony itself with perhaps a small gathering afterward. The offer of a community celebration spoke to their acceptance as a couple, their recognition as part of the larger Frontier family. That's very generous, Ethan said, touching his hat respectfully. But we wouldn't want to put anyone to any trouble. Nonsense, Martha replied briskly. A wedding is a community affair out here. We all depend on each other, and celebrating the formation of new families is part of what keeps us strong. She smiled at Clara with genuine affection. Besides, your father was well loved in this county. It's only fitting that his daughter's wedding be properly honored. Clara felt tears threaten again at the mention of her father. She knew he would have been pleased to see her settled with a good man, and she could almost imagine his approval of Ethan's steady character and gentle treatment of her. We would be honored, she said quietly. Thank you. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the first snowflakes of the season drift down in the lamplight, Clara and Ethan discussed their plans for the future. The wedding would take place in 2 weeks' time, after the harvest work was completely finished and before the weather became too severe for travel. They would spend their first winter as a married couple learning to live together in the close quarters of the cabin, preparing for the spring planting that would be their first shared crop. Are you nervous? Clara asked as they watched the snow begin to accumulate on the porch rail. About the wedding? Or about being married? Ethan's voice was thoughtful in the gathering darkness. Both, I suppose. Ethan was quiet for a moment, and Clara could hear the soft sound of snowflakes landing on the roof above them. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but certain. I was nervous when I was traveling alone, always wondering what was over the next hill. But sitting here with you, planning our life together, I feel more settled than I have since I was a boy." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. "The only thing that makes me nervous now is the thought of not being worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Clara turned to study his profile in the lamplight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way snow crystals caught in his dark hair. "You've already proven yourself worthy. Every day, in a dozen small ways. I hope you'll still feel that way after we've been married for 20 years. "I think," Clara said slowly, "that I'll feel it even more strongly then." They sat in comfortable silence as the snow continued to fall, each lost in their own thoughts about the future they were building together. Clara thought about the child she had been when her father first brought her to this land, and the woman she had become through hardship and loss and ultimately through love. Ethan had brought her not just companionship but partnership, someone to share both the burdens and the joys of frontier life. "Clara," Ethan said suddenly, his voice soft in the snowy stillness, "I have something for you." He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth. When Clara unwrapped it, she found a simple gold ring set with a small but perfectly clear diamond. "It was my grandmother's," Ethan explained as Clara stared at the ring in wonder. "My mother gave it to me before she died, said I should save it for the woman I wanted to spend my life with." He took the ring from her trembling fingers and slipped it onto her hand, where it fit as if it had been made for her. "I've been carrying it for 20 years, waiting for the right moment." Clara looked down at the ring sparkling on her finger, then up at Ethan's face, illuminated by love and snowlight. "It's beautiful, but are you sure? This is a family heirloom. And now you're going to be family." Ethan lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her fingers just above the ring. "My family." As they finally rose to go inside, Clara took one last look at the snow-covered landscape that surrounded their home. Tomorrow they would wake to a changed world, white and clean and full of possibility. And in 2 weeks' time, she would wake as Ethan's wife, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. But tonight, sitting by the fire with her hand in his in her father's cabin filled with the quiet contentment of two people who had found their place in the world, Clara felt that the future had already begun. The slow pace they had chosen, the careful building of trust and affection and partnership, had brought them to this moment of perfect understanding. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the prairie in pristine white and marking the end of one season and the beginning of another. And inside, beside the warmth of their fire, Clara and Ethan planned their tomorrow with the quiet confidence of two people who had learned that the best things in life were worth waiting for,